Nathaniel Calloway had learned, a long time ago, to trust numbers more than people. Numbers never smiled at you while planning to hurt you. Numbers never promised you a future and then quietly changed it behind your back. A number just sat still on a page, honest about what it was. Nate had built his whole life around that one simple loyalty. He was 40 years old. On a humid Tuesday morning, he drove into Baton Rouge with a laptop bag on the seat beside him and a folder of plant data he hadn't been given permission to see yet. The plant rose up along the river like a small steel city, its stacks breathing thin white smoke into a gray sky. He parked, checked his watch, and sat still for exactly 90 seconds before getting out of the car. Not nerves, he told himself. Just habit. He always gave himself 90 seconds before walking into a new job. Enough time to settle, but not enough time to ask himself why he needed it. Sofia Ridgeway stood at the head of the conference table, arms crossed loosely. Not defensive, just tired, the kind of tired that lives in the shoulders. She was 37, dressed in a gray blazer she'd clearly put on in a hurry, and she watched the man from the consulting firm set his laptop down with a strange kind of precision, almost like a ritual. "Mr. Calloway," she said, holding out her hand. "Thank you for coming on short notice." "Nate." His handshake was quick and businesslike. "I read the batch records on the flight down. I have some questions before we start the tour. No small talk. No comment on the drive, the weather, the plant." Something in Sofia's chest tightened a little. Not offense, more like a quiet recalculation. Most people wanted her to like them before they got to work. This man clearly wanted it the other way around. "Go ahead," she said. "Your iodine values started drifting 11 days ago. Not slowly, in sudden steps. That tells me something changed at one exact point, not something that wore down over time. Do you have a log of feedstock changes for that window?" Sofia blinked, then felt the corner of her mouth lift despite herself. "Roy," she called toward the door, where the plant manager was hovering like a man bracing for an insult. "Get Mr. Calloway the lot changeover log." Roy Guidry didn't move right away. He was in his early 50s, built like a man who'd spent 30 years on his feet, and he didn't love strangers walking into his plant asking sharp questions before they'd even seen a reactor. "We already checked the obvious things," he said, arms folding, chin lifting half an inch. "Temperature, pressure, agitation rate. Nothing's out of spec." "I believe you," Nate said, and something in his voice made Roy's arms loosen, surprised. "I'm not here to catch a mistake. I'm here to find a mistake nobody's supposed to be able to see yet. That's a different job." Roy studied him a moment longer, then went to get the log himself, muttering something about coffee. Outside, at the reception desk, Delphine Fontaine had watched the whole thing through the glass wall. She'd appointed herself the unofficial historian of Sofia's life years ago, and she took the job seriously. She was 37 too, and she'd grown up 2 streets over from Sofia, in a Baton Rouge that still smelled, in her memory, like her grandmother's kitchen. When Sofia stepped out for a breath of air, Del fell in a step beside her without asking. "Well," Del said, "he counts his smiles like they cost money." Sofia let out a short laugh. "He's here to fix a hydrogenation problem, Del. Not charm the front desk. I'm just saying. I offered him coffee, and he looked at me like I'd offered him a loan with hidden fees." Del watched Nate through the glass as he crouched by the printer, reading a stray report from the tray, unable to help himself. Careful men are either running from something or hiding something. Good to know which, before you get too comfortable. Sofia didn't answer that right away. She just watched him a moment longer. The way he stood with his weight, even on both feet, arms never quite crossing, like a man always ready to leave a room in a hurry if he had to. There was something else too, something she couldn't quite name until Del said it for her. "Have you noticed?" Del said, lowering her voice. "He never actually smiles. Not even the polite, kind people do, just to be doing it. That whole time in there, he looked like a man reading his own eulogy. He looked focused. He looked sad, Sofia. There's a difference." Del tilted her head, studying him with the frank curiosity she brought to most things. "Stiff, too. Watch how he shakes hands, like he's counting to 1 and letting go before it means anything. And he answers every question with 3 words fewer than you'd expect. I don't think that man has had an unnecessary conversation in a decade. Maybe he just doesn't like people. Maybe. Or maybe people didn't much like him once, and he's been careful ever since. Del shrugged, the observation offered lightly, without any real weight behind it yet. Either way, gloomy as a wet Tuesday, that one. But did you see how fast he read that iodine drift? Roy's team sat on that for 11 days. He had a theory before he'd finished his coffee. I noticed, Sofia said, and there was something almost reluctant in her voice, the sound of a woman filing away a fact she wasn't ready to do anything with yet. Whatever he's outside of the numbers, he's very good at the numbers. That's usually how it goes with the quiet ones, Del said. All the warmth gets rerouted into the one thing they trust. By the end of that first week, the impression had settled into something like consensus around the plant, murmured in the break room, exchanged in glances on the production floor. Roy called him the Undertaker behind his back, not unkindly, more in the tone of a man giving in to the obvious. Priya, less unkind about it, told Del privately that Nate reminded her of a professor she'd had who never once smiled through an entire semester and was, without question, the best teacher she'd ever had. Nobody disagreed with either description, and nobody, watching him work a problem, doubted for a second that he'd find the answer before he was done. It didn't take long for the ice to start cracking, just a little at the edges. By the 4th day, Sofia had started coming down to the production floor herself, hard hat pushed back on her head, wearing boots that clearly belonged to someone who used to work the floor for a living. Nate noticed that before he noticed almost anything else about her, that she read a piping diagram like a native speaker, not like an executive who'd memorized just enough vocabulary to sound competent in meetings. You used to run process here, he said. Not a question. Before I ran the company, yes. She traced a line on the diagram without touching the paper, an old habit. 5 years of night shifts. My father wanted me to earn the corner office, not just inherit it. Priya Anand, the young process engineer trailing them with a tablet, looked up with something close to reverence. She joined Ridgeway 2 years ago, straight out of LSU, and she'd learned fast that Sofia could still catch a math error faster than the engineers who'd made it. Nate watched Sofia bite the corner of her pen when Priya read out a number that didn't match the expected trend. A small, unconscious thing, teeth against plastic, eyes narrowing like she could scare the number into confessing. He filed it away, the way he filed everything, without deciding yet what it meant. The real crack, though, came 2 days later in the lobby, in a moment nobody had planned. Mia showed up at 4 in the afternoon, for years old and furious about it, clutching a stuffed alligator and trailing an apologetic babysitter who explained, all in one breath, that a pipe had flooded the daycare and she hadn't been able to reach Sofia's phone. Sofia was on a call with the client's quality director. Del crouched down to Mia's height instead. Hey, baby, want to color while mommy finishes up? I don't want to color, Mia announced, with a flat finality only a 4-year-old can manage. I want to build a tower. Nate, waiting on a call of his own, looked up from his phone. There was a pile of leftover wooden blocks in the corner from some children's event the plant had hosted once, and without much ceremony, he got down on the floor beside her. Not crouching at a cautious distance the way he did with almost everyone, but folding his whole frame down to the carpet, cross-legged, like the floor was exactly where he meant to be. You want it tall, or you want it to stand up? He asked, and his voice had changed too. The clipped, economical tone he used with Roy and the investors had gone soft, almost playful, like a switch had been thrown somewhere out of sight. Mia frowned at him, deeply suspicious of the question. Both. Can't always have both, Nate said, stacking 2 blocks, and he was smiling now, not the rare, ration half-smile Del had clocked on his first day, but an open, easy one, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. Wide base, it stands but it's short. Narrow base, it goes tall, but he set a 3rd block slightly off-center and the little tower swayed. See that? The weight's not centered. It wants to fall. So fix it. That's the job. He nudged the block back to center. Anything tall needs a wide enough bottom to hold it up, or it comes down. Doesn't matter if it's blocks or buildings, or he almost caught himself before he said it. Reactors. Mia considered this with enormous seriousness, then knocked the tower down herself, just to see it fall on her own terms instead of gravity's. Nate laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded, the second one in as many minutes like laughing had turned out to be easy after all once nobody was watching him do it. Sofia, stepping out of her office mid-call, muted her phone for exactly 3 seconds. She stood in the hallway and watched a man who spoke to her only in load calculations and iodine values get down on a dirty floor, grinning, patient, endlessly attentive to a 4-year-old who was, by any reasonable measure, being fairly bossy about block architecture. It wasn't just that he was good with Mia. It was that he seemed, for the first time since he'd arrived, entirely comfortable. As if the version of himself that flinched from coffee and, count his words, had simply stepped out of the room, and someone easier had taken his place. Something in her chest shifted, and she didn't have a technical word for it. She found Dell at the front desk a few minutes later, still faintly stunned. "You will not believe what I just saw. Try me, Nate, on the lobby floor, playing blocks with Mia, smiling. More than once, delicate actual smiling." Dell's eyebrows went up. The Nate who introduces himself with his last name first. That Nate. Sofia glanced back down the hall, as if to check it had really happened. I've spent 2 weeks getting maybe 3 words out of him about anything that isn't a reactor. My daughter gets a full performance. Jokes. Voices. I think I heard him do a voice for the alligator. Huh. Dell considered this with real interest. The same curiosity she brought to a locked filing cabinet. Some people save all their soft parts for someone who can't ask them any follow-up questions. Meaning what? Meaning I don't know yet. Dell watched Nate through the glass, still crouched with Mia, rebuilding the tower at her insistence. But a man doesn't learn to be that gentle with a 4-year-old by accident. Somebody taught him that once, or something did. Sofia didn't answer. She only watched a while longer, turning the mystery over the way she turned over an unexplained number on a trend chart. Not urgent, not yet, but impossible to fully set down. By the second week, the two of them had settled into a rhythm of long nights. And it was in those quiet hours, more than anywhere else, that the walls between them finally started to come down. The control room door made a particular sound at 11 at night, a soft click Sofia had come to associate with the last hour of any long day, when the plant hummed low and steady, and the only 2 people left were her and the consultant who had, somewhere along the way, stopped being just a consultant. "You don't talk about yourself," she said one night, not looking up from the trend screen. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like an observation, offered the way you'd offer a data point. Nate didn't answer right away. He adjusted a valve setting on the simulation, watched the curve respond, and only then said, "There was a woman, Vanessa. We worked together 7 years ago. I built something, a catalyst formula, nothing dramatic, just careful, honest work, and she put her name on the patent before mine ever got attached." His jaw tightened just slightly. She left the week after it cleared. I spent the next year being the engineer nobody wanted to hire because the story that survived wasn't the true one. It was the one she told first. Sofia was quiet for a moment. Then, because his honesty seemed to deserve an equal weight of her own, she said, "There was a man named Julian. Worked in finance, helping us through the worst of my father's estate. We were together while everything was falling apart, and the moment it got heavy, lawyers, debt, my father's old partner tried to take the company. He decided he wasn't ready. Her hand found the edge of the desk, gripped it once, let go. He found out about Mia before he left for Chicago. He still sent a check every month. That's the whole relationship now. A check." Nate looked at her for a long moment. Not with pity. She would have hated that, and he seemed to know it without being told, but with something quieter. Recognition, maybe. 2 people who'd each learned, the hard way, that leaving can look exactly like love, right up until the moment it doesn't. People who go, he said slowly, the second things get expensive, I used to think that was rare. Now, I think it's just common enough to plan around. And the ones who stay? I don't know yet, he said. Haven't run that experiment in a while. She almost smiled. Almost. That same week, without either of them quite planning it, Nate found himself pulled a little further into Sofia's world, starting, of all places, with her mother. Eleanor Ridgeway came by the plant most Thursdays around 5, an old arrangement from the years before Sofia could afford a second babysitter. She used the waiting time the way she used most idle minutes, reading whatever was in front of her. That Thursday, what was in front of her was a whiteboard in the lobby that someone had forgotten to erase, a rough sketch of a hydrogenation curve, half a mass balance, and a note in the margin about catalyst poisoning. "You wrote this?" she asked, when Nate came through the lobby with his bag over one shoulder. He stopped, wary the way he was wary of most unplanned conversations. "Sorry, I should have wiped that. Force of habit." "Don't you dare." Eleanor was already studying it more closely, arms crossed, the exact same posture Sofia used over a diagram, though neither woman would have called it inherited. "I taught high school chemistry for 31 years. You learn to spot who actually understands what they're drawing and who's just copying vocabulary. You understand it." She tapped the board once. "Also, my daughter tells me you've been living on vending machine sandwiches for 2 weeks, which is a crime I intend to correct personally. Thursday, 6 o'clock. I make a gumbo that used to get written up in the parish newsletter, and I'd like an honest opinion on it for once, instead of Sofia telling me it's fine because she doesn't feel like cooking." Nate opened his mouth to decline, out of pure reflex, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't want to. "I wouldn't want to intrude on a family dinner. It stopped being just a family dinner the moment you fixed my granddaughter's block tower," Eleanor said, already gathering her things. 6 o'clock. "Don't bring wine. I have opinions about wine, and none of them are kind." When Sofia heard about it that evening, not from Nate, who hadn't mentioned it, but from her mother's triumphant phone call, she laughed for a full 10 seconds before she could get a sentence out. "You interrogated my consultant over a whiteboard." "I invited a colleague to dinner," Eleanor said primly. "You're the one turning it into something else." "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to, baby. I could hear you smiling through the phone." Eleanor's house smelled like rue and cut grass. Meme Vivian held court from the head of the table, 85 years old and sharper than half the boardroom Sofia dealt with every week. She watched Nate all through dinner. Watched him cut Mia's chicken into smaller pieces without being asked. Watched him listen to Eleanor's chemistry stories with his full attention instead of the polite half-attention most guests offer. Watched him turn down a second, helping not out of manners, but because he genuinely seemed uneasy being given more than a share. After dinner, out on the porch, while Sofia carried a sleepy Mia inside, Vivian caught Nate's sleeve between 2 fingers. "You don't talk much," she said. "No, ma'am." "Good. Talkers fill up a room, so you can't see what's really there." She studied him with dark, clear eyes. "I've watched men come near this family before. Some come for the company. Some come because a wounded woman looks like a project." Her grip tightened slightly on his sleeve. "You don't look at her like a project." "No, ma'am," Nate said again, quieter this time. "I don't." Vivian let go of his sleeve, satisfied, and murmured something in Cajun French. Eleanor, stepping out onto the porch just then, caught it and translated with a small, knowing smile. She said, "You're the kind who stays when the weather turns. Everyone else goes looking for clear sky somewhere else." Nate didn't have an answer for that. He only looked toward the door, where Sofia had reappeared, Mia asleep against her shoulder, and something in his chest, some old valve that had been shut for longer than he could easily measure, opened just a little. That small opening didn't stay small for long. It only took one bad night to widen it. The fever came at 1 in the morning, the kind that made a 4-year-old's whole body feel like a furnace running past its limit. Sofia was torn between the hospital and a reactor 2 hours from a critical hold point, and it was Nate who ended the argument before it started. "Go," he said, already reaching for his coat. "I've got the reactor. I'll text you every reading." He spent the night alone in the control room, phone propped against a monitor, sending Sofia a steady stream of numbers. Temp holding 320 degrees Fahrenheit, agitator stable, catalyst activity within range. Plain, clinical language that, to a mother sitting in a pediatric ER at 3 in the morning, read like the tenderest thing anyone had said to her in years. She read each message twice. She didn't tell him that. By morning, Mia's fever had broken, and so, in its own quiet way, had something in Sofia. She got back to the plant at 7 to find Eleanor, and Vivian had beaten her there, setting out biscuits and coffee on the break room table for the man who stayed up all night minding somebody else's child. As Vivian put it, handing Nate a cup without asking if he wanted one. "You didn't have to do that," Nate said, meaning the reactor, meaning the whole night. "I know," Vivian said, watching him over the rim of her own cup. "That's how I know." A few days later, once Mia was fully recovered and restless again, the good feeling from that night found its way into something even smaller and warmer. It happened almost by accident on a Saturday visit to the plant when Mia found a bottle of dish soap in the break room and announced her plan to make the biggest bubble in Louisiana. Nate, waiting on a lab result, ended up crouched beside her again. No, not crouched, Sofia noted from the doorway, fully seated on the floor again, sleeves pushed up, entirely given over to the task, showing her how to dip the wand slowly, how a bubble popped if you pinched it too hard or blew too fast. "Soap makes the water stretchy," he explained, watching a wobbly sphere drift toward the ceiling, his voice carrying that same easy warmth Sofia had heard exactly twice before. Both times with Mia, never once with anyone else. Water alone can't hold a shape like that. It needs something to lower the tension, to let it bend without breaking. Mia watched a bubble land on her hand and vanish. "Like you," she said, with the plain, devastating honesty only children have. "You make mommy less tight." Nate said nothing for a moment. Then Mia, having apparently decided he needed a name that was hers alone, announced, "You're Nate," and refused, from that day on, to call him anything else. And something in the way he repeated it back to her, quietly, like he was trying to sound it on for size, told Sofia this bond wasn't a performance he was giving for her benefit. It was real, and it ran somewhere deep, and she still didn't have the first idea why. She waited until Mia had run off chasing another bubble before she asked the question out loud. "You're different with her," Sofia said. "You know that." Nate's easy expression didn't vanish exactly, but something in it closed by half an inch, like a door not quite shutting all the way. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." She kept her voice light, not pushing. "I watched you go quiet in board meetings. I watched you give investors as few words as legally possible. And then she hands you a bubble wand, and you turn into," she searched for the word, "someone I haven't met yet." Nate watched the girl a moment longer before he answered. "Some people are easier to be around than others." He said it simply, like a fact, and Sofia understood from the flatness of his voice that the conversation was over, whether or not she wanted it to be. She didn't push, but she filed the moment away, the same careful way he filed things, and did not forget it. That night, after Mia had gone home with her grandmother and the plant had gone quiet, Nate sat alone in the rental car in the parking lot. Engine off, hands on the wheel, doing nothing in particular. He was good at doing nothing when a decision needed avoiding. Tonight, the decision was Sofia. He turned it over the same careful way he turned over any variable he didn't trust yet. He'd rebuild a company's confidence in 11 days. He'd quantified a failure mode off a whiteboard sketch. He made a 4-year-old laugh so hard over a bubble wand she'd nearly fallen over. None of it changed the plain arithmetic underneath all of it, which was that he had nothing to offer a woman like Sofia except a resume with a well-documented scandal in the middle of it, and an old grief he'd spent 11 years learning to carry quietly instead of talking about. She ran a company. She had a mother, a grandmother, a whole town of people ready to stand between her and anyone who might hurt her again. He had a rental car and a habit of not calling people back. And there was the plant to think about, too. Roy's careful new respect, Priya's earnest deference. The fragile professional footing he'd only just built with people who'd once looked at him like a liability walking in the door. Consultants did not become something else to their clients halfway through a contract. That was how reputations ended, and as had already ended once, over a woman's name attached to the wrong story. He wasn't going to gamble the only trust he had left on a feeling he couldn't run a mass balance on. He was still turning it over 3 days later when Dell found him in the break room at 7 in the morning, alone, staring at a coffee he hadn't touched. "You're doing the thing," Dell said, sliding into the chair across from him without asking. "What thing?" "The thing where you decide something's too dangerous to want, so you just stop wanting it out loud. I watched you do it with the last biscuit at my mother's table. Now I'm watching you do it with my best friend." She said it plainly, no cruelty in it, just the flat confidence of a woman who didn't waste time circling a point. "You think I haven't noticed you leave 2 feet of space between you and her in that control room? Like it's a safety code." Nate didn't answer right away. "It's not my place." "Says who?" "Says the fact that I'm a contractor she's paying by the hour. Says the fact that half this plant still isn't fully sure I'm not the reason the numbers went bad in the first place." He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and looked at the coffee instead of at her. She deserves somebody without a file folder's worth of history attached to him. Everybody's got a file folder, Nate. Sofia's is thicker than most. Dell leaned forward, her voice softening but losing none of its certainty. "You want to know what I actually see when I watch the two of you? I see a woman who laughs different around you than she does around anyone else in her life. I see her waiting until you're done reading a trend line before she says goodnight, when she used to leave the second the numbers looked fine. I see my goddaughter call you a name she made up herself. And trust me, that child does not hand those out for free." She held his eyes until he had to look back at her. "Sofia doesn't let people get close. You know that better than most, because you've watched her not do it with everybody else here. She's doing it with you. That could be relief. The plant isn't burning down anymore." "Could be," Dell agreed. "Or you could ask her, instead of deciding for both of you what she's allowed to feel." She sat back, arms crossed, not unkindly. "You're the most careful man I've ever met, and I understand exactly why. But you don't get points for protecting somebody from a version of you that only exists in your own head. Take the risk. Worst case, you're wrong, and you go back to being the quiet consultant who reads other people's reports off the printer tray when he thinks nobody's looking." She stood, already halfway to the door. "Best case, you stop coming down here at 7 in the morning to argue with a cold cup of coffee." She left him with that. Nate sat along while after she'd gone, turning her words over exactly the way he turned over data he wasn't ready to trust yet. Except this time, for once and longer than he could remember, some part of him wanted the number to come out a certain way. He didn't act on it right away. He wasn't built for right away. But something in him had shifted quietly, the way a slow reaction finally finds enough heat to move. For 3 weeks, everything had been moving towards something warm. Then, quietly in a different corner of the same building, something else started moving too. It began, for Dell, as a small unease she couldn't quite name. She'd watched Sofia's guardedness thaw for 3 weeks now. Watch her best friend actually laugh, not the careful executive laugh she performed in meetings, and some old protective instinct in Dell refused to let that thaw go unexamined. People who show up right when a company is most exposed, she told herself. You check them twice. She started with Nate's public record. Nothing invasive, just the kind of quiet due diligence a careful friend runs without announcing it. A patent database, a name she hadn't expected to find. Vanessa Cole, listed on an old filing, years before Nate ever came to Baton Rouge. It might have stayed a footnote, but 3 days later, running a completely separate check. Routine vendor due diligence on Cascade Lipid Supply, the new feedstock supplier whose product had shown up right around the time the contamination started. Dell found the same name again. Vanessa Cole, Director of Business Development, Cascade Lipid Supply, LLC. Dell sat very still at her desk, feeling the particular cold of 2 unrelated worries turning out to be the same worry. She didn't go to Sofia first. She told herself it was because she didn't want to hurt her friend over a coincidence that might mean nothing. The harder truth underneath that was that some part of her wanted to give Nate a chance to explain himself before this became Sofia's problem too. She found him alone in the lab annex, reviewing a chromatography trace. Vanessa Cole, Dell said, no preamble, watching him closely. Tell me that's not the same Vanessa. Nate's whole body went still. Not dramatically, but completely the stillness of a man who's just heard a name land like a dropped instrument. His jaw tightened. His hands, relaxed a moment ago, closed slowly into loose fists. Where did you hear that name? He said. It wasn't really a question. I need you to answer me, Nate. He didn't. He looked at the wall, at the trace on the screen, anywhere but at Dell, and said only, I need to look into something, before gathering his laptop and walking out without another word. Leaving Dell standing there with the uneasy feeling that she'd just watched a guilty man run. He wasn't running from guilt. He was running from the old, familiar terror of being disbelieved again before he had proof of anything. But Dell couldn't see inside him, so she couldn't know that. 2 days after that, Roy Guidry, staying late to finish a report, noticed the vendor system logged in under Nate's credentials at 9 at night, well outside any hours he'd been authorized for that kind of access. Roy, who'd spent 3 weeks slowly warming up to the outside consultant, felt his old wariness snap back into place. He said nothing to Nate. He went straight to Dell. All 3 threads, Dell's discovery, Nate's silence, Roy's report, met in one room on a Wednesday afternoon, and what had been building quietly for days finally broke out into the open. The confrontation happened in Sofia's office, door closed, blinds drawn for once. Dell laid it out first. Vanessa's name in Nate's old patent record, Vanessa's name at Cascade Lipid Supply, Nate's unexplained late-night access to vendor files, and last, the fact that she'd already gone to Nate directly, days ago, and gotten nothing but silence and a fast exit. Break time equals 0. 5S/. Sofia listened with her arms crossed tight, knuckles pale, her jaw trembling with the tension of someone holding back a much bigger reaction. When Dell finished, Sofia turned to Nate. Is it true? Some of it, Nate said. His voice was low and careful, each word placed like he was defusing something. Vanessa is the woman I told you about. And yes, I found her name at Cascade Lipid Supply, the same night Dell did, I think. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't have proof of anything yet. I've been trying to find it. You've been investigating my vendor, Sofia said, in secret, for days, without telling me. After the 2 of us sat in that control room, and you told me things you said you'd never told anyone. I know how it looks. Then help me see how it's anything else. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated that it did. Nate's hands opened and closed once at his sides, the closest thing to a plea his body allowed itself. 7 years ago, I told the truth, and nobody believed me, because the woman standing next to me told a better story first. I panicked. I didn't want to be in that position again, accused before I had anything to defend myself with. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened. That's exactly what worries me, Sofia said, quieter now. And somehow that was worse than shouting. That you'd rather disappear into your own head than trust me with the truth while it was still forming. The silence that followed had real weight to it. The specific heaviness of a room where 3 people who cared about each other had just hurt one another badly. Nate looked at the floor, then at Delaware, then last at Sofia. I understand if you want me off this contract, he said, his voice gone flat, retreating into old armor. I'll finish the technical handoff to Priya by end of week. He left the office without waiting for her to answer. That night, with nowhere else that felt right, he drove to the river's edge, to a stretch of bank near the plant where the water moved slow and brown under a sky, just starting to purple. He sat on the hood of his car for a long time, not thinking about reactors, not thinking about numbers, just watching the current do the one thing it always did, indifferent to whoever was watching. Here it is again, he thought. The same shape of disaster, the same silence closing over my head. Except this time, there had been a small girl who called him Nate, and an old woman who said he was the kind who stays. And some part of him, a part he'd kept locked for 7 years, didn't want to let the river carry this one away in silence, the way he'd let everything go the last time. He didn't leave. He just didn't know yet how to stay. The answer he needed came from somewhere he hadn't expected. Not from himself, but from someone he'd quietly been teaching without meaning to. Priya found it at 10 the next morning, half by instinct, half by the stubborn thoroughness Nate himself had taught her over 3 weeks of quiet mentorship. She'd gone back through the shipment records from Cascade Lipid Supply, working through the feedstock composition batch by batch. Not looking for what was wrong on paper, since the certificates of analysis were clean, deceptively so, but for what would only fail under the exact hydrogenation conditions Ridgeway used. She found it in a detail most people would have missed, a trace contaminant that only turned catalytically poisonous under Ridgeway's specific temperature and pressure window. A weakness that could only have been designed by someone who understood the original, unpublished research behind Nate's old catalyst formula. Research that had disappeared from his old company's files the same month Vanessa left. Priya sat back from her screen, hands unsteady, understanding all at once what she was looking at. Not a coincidence. A weapon built from a piece of Nate's own stolen work, aimed at a company he'd come to love almost by accident. She brought it straight to Sofia and Del. Sofia read the analysis twice, feeling something in her chest give way. Not relief exactly, more like a hard, humbling correction. He wasn't hiding involvement, she said quietly. He was hiding a wound. He went looking for proof alone because the last time he told the truth, nobody believed him without it. Del closed her eyes briefly, and I confronted him like he was already guilty. We both did. Sofia found Nate exactly where some instinct told her he'd be. At the river, still on the hood of his car, jacket collar up against a wind that had picked up off the water. She walked up slowly, giving him time to see her coming, and stopped a few feet away. Priya found it, she said. The contamination only makes sense if someone used your original research to build it. You weren't part of this. You were the first person it ever hurt. Nate didn't say anything right away. His shoulders, drawn up tight around his ears since the night before, dropped by degrees, like tension finally finding somewhere to go. I should have told you the second I saw her name, he said. I didn't, because some old part of me still believes that telling the truth early just gives people more time to decide not to believe it. I know. Sofia sat down on the hood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And I should have asked you before I let myself believe the worst. My father's old partner taught me to distrust anyone who shows up right when the company's weak. Julian taught me that people leave the second things get expensive. She turned to face him fully. I'll let both of those men decide how I'd treat you before you'd even had a chance to explain yourself. That wasn't fair. I'm sorry. Nate looked at her for a long moment. Really looked the way he looked at a trend line when he was finally starting to trust what it was telling him. Then, slowly, he reached over and took her hand. Not a big gesture, just fingers closing around fingers, steady, simple, asking for nothing except to be allowed to continue. I'm still learning how to stay, he said, but I'd like to practice if you'll let me. Stay, Sofia said. It came out simpler than she expected. Just stay. That same evening, once the two of them had made their peace, Del found her own reckoning waiting for her too. She stepped into Sofia's office and closed the door behind her. I should have come to you the moment I found his name, Del said. Not after I'd already half convicted him in my own head. You were protecting me. Badly, but you were. Sofia managed a tired smile. We're both going to have to get better at trusting people before we have the whole picture. 30 years of friendship, Del said, and we're still learning that lesson. Slow reaction, I guess. Some reactions need more activation energy than others, Sofia said, and for the first time all week, they both actually laughed. With the truth finally settled between them, one thing still remained. A reckoning that belonged to Nate alone, and to the woman who'd started all of it 7 years ago. The emergency meeting was set for the following Thursday in Ridgeway's own legal conference room. Cascade Lipid Supplies Council had requested it, hoping, Sofia suspected, to negotiate something quiet before the evidence went any further. Sofia told Nate the truth plainly. Vanessa would be in the room. He didn't have to be. I want to be there, Nate said. Not for her. For the version of me that didn't get to be there last time. Vanessa Cole arrived at 10 in the morning, composed, sharp-suited, the same practice calm Nate remembered from years ago, the calm of someone who'd learned that confidence, worn well enough, could pass for honesty in almost any room. She sat down across the table, opened her folder, and began speaking in the smooth, procedural language of someone expecting to negotiate a quiet settlement. Then she looked up and saw Nate seated beside Sofia's legal counsel, and for exactly 1 second, her composure cracked. Her spine, already perfectly straight, stiffened further. Her hand, resting on the folder, curled slightly inward, no longer relaxed. She recovered fast, a small, tight smile, a slight lift of the chin, but that 1 second had already told the room everything it needed to know. Nate, she said too brightly, I didn't realize you'd be involved in this. I built the research your company weaponized against a client of mine, Nate said. His voice was even, unhurried. Not the voice of a man out for revenge, but the voice of someone reading a well-verified result off a screen. I'd say that makes me fairly involved. He set a folder of his own on the table. The original notebooks, time-stamped, witnessed the unpublished data behind the catalyst formula Vanessa had once claimed as solely her own. This is the original research. Every entry dated, every signature verified. It matches, line for line, the contamination pattern Ridgeway's team found in the Cascade feedstock. I'd like that noted for the record. You always did take these things so personally, Vanessa said, an old, familiar needle, the same one she'd used on him 7 years ago. It was never about credit, Nate. It was business. It stopped being about credit for me a long time ago, Nate said, and something in his tone made even Vanessa's lawyer glance up. This isn't about what you took from me. It's about the people who trusted a supply chain to be honest and got poison batches instead. That's not business. That's just harm, dressed up in paperwork. Beside him, Sofia said nothing. She'd agreed beforehand to let the facts speak. But her hand found the arm of his chair under the table, resting there, silent and steady, a small anchor he could feel without needing to look down. It was, he thought, the first time in 7 years that someone had simply stood beside him in a room like this, instead of leaving him to face it alone. Vanessa's composure didn't survive the hour. She tried twice more to steer the conversation back towards settlement, her voice climbing half a register each time, her hands growing restless in a way they hadn't been at the start. A pen turned over and over, a folder squared and re-squared for no reason. By the time the meeting ended, her own lawyer was visibly recalculating the size of the problem in front of him. She left the room without shaking anyone's hand, her heels sharp and fast against the tile. A retreat dressed up as a departure. She hadn't lost to anger. She'd lost to a truth that, this time, had shown up with enough evidence behind it to survive contact with a room full of lawyers. 2 days after Vanessa left that conference room for the last time, Del sat down to finish the kind of paperwork nobody enjoys, the formal background verification that the legal team wanted on file, now that Nate's original research had become evidence in an active case. It was routine. Dates, employers, licenses, most of it already half-assembled weeks ago while she'd been chasing Vanessa's name through old records. But doing it properly this time, she went back further than she had before and found a small notice in a Shreveport newspaper archive, 11 years old, easy to miss unless you already knew to look. A private memorial service. A photograph too small and grainy to make out clearly, except for the eyes, which she recognized immediately. Josephine Josie Calloway, for years old, beloved daughter of the late Robert and Marianne Calloway, dearly loved little sister of Nathaniel Calloway, who had helped raise her almost single-handedly from the time she was a baby, after their mother's long illness left her unable to. Dell sat with that for a long moment, the office quiet around her. Then, almost without deciding to, she kept looking and found what she hadn't expected, a small, recurring line in a Children's Hospital Foundation newsletter. The same hospital, every year for 11 years, a modest, steady donation to the pediatric ward, filed under a name that meant nothing to anyone reading it except, now, to her. As far as any record showed, he'd never spoken about her publicly, not once in 11 years. She thought about the lobby floor, the block tower, the bubbles. You make mommy less tight. She thought about a man who counted his words with adults like they cost something and had, without any effort at all, an entire second language reserved only for a 4-year-old with a stuffed alligator. A language, she now understood, he'd first learned years before any of this, packing some other little girl's lunch before daycare. She didn't tell Nate she knew. She wanted to find Sofia instead. "I need to tell you something," Dell said, closing the office door behind her, "and I need you to hear it as something I found, not something I'm handing you to use." She told her plainly. The notice, the little sister he'd all but raised himself, the age Josie had been when she died, the 11 quiet years of a donation nobody was ever thanked for making. Sofia listened without moving, one hand pressed flat against her own collarbone, and when Dell finished, she didn't say anything for a while. "That's why," Sofia finally said, very quietly. That's why Mia, Dell agreed. He never said a word. "Would you have in his place?" Sofia thought of the block tower, the bubbles, the sound of a laugh she'd never heard him give anyone else. She thought of a man who trusted numbers because numbers didn't ask him to explain himself, and who had, once, been the only steady thing in a little girl's whole world, and who had, somehow, found room to be that again for a 4-year-old who wasn't even his, asking nothing in return. "No," she said, "I don't think I would have either." She never raised it with him directly, not that week, not the next. It didn't feel like hers to raise. But something in the way she watched him with Mia changed after that, softened into something closer to understanding than curiosity, and if Nate noticed the shift, he never asked about it, and she never told him why. With the confrontation behind them, all that remained was for the last piece to fall quietly into place. The client audit came 3 days later and passed without a single flag deviation. The corrected feedstock protocol holding steady, the new heavy metal screening system catching a minor contaminant on its very first run, proof enough that the fix would hold. The contract, and with it the company Sofia's father had built and nearly lost twice, was safe. That evening, Nate found Sofia on the riverbank again. Though this time she'd come looking for him on purpose, Mia's small hand in hers, the girl clutching her stuffed alligator and demanding, loudly, that Nate show her how the water moved. "It doesn't move in a straight line," he told her, crouching down so they were eye to eye. "See how it curves around that point of land? Water finds the easiest path, but still gets where it's going." "Like us," Mia said, with the confident, slightly bossy air of a child repeating something she'd half understood and fully claimed as her own. Sofia laughed, and Nate, straightening up beside her, felt that laugh land somewhere in his chest like warmth after a long winter. Once Mia had wandered off to interrogate a curious hare a safe distance away, Sofia bumped her shoulder against his. "You know, the first week you were here, Dell timed how long it took you to say more than 5 words to anyone who wasn't Roy. She had a stopwatch. I want you to know that. I remember. I also remember being offered coffee like it was a loan with hidden fees." Sofia tilted her head, studying him with the same frank curiosity Dell always claimed as her own trademark. "You used to shake my hand like you were counting to 1 and letting go before it meant anything." I didn't believe her until I tried it myself. "In my defense," Nate said, "I hadn't met you yet. You were still just a name on a contract. And now I'd let you hold my hand a lot longer than 1 second," he said, and reached over to prove it, lacing his fingers through hers right there on the bank. Turns out that was the easy part. The hard part was the 2 feet of space I used to leave between us in the control room. Dell called it a safety code. It It was not a safety code. No, Nate admitted. It was me deciding every single night not to close the distance, and then closing it anyway by morning without noticing I had. Sofia laughed, shaking her head. Somewhere in that filing system of yours, there's an entire folder labeled Sofia, isn't there? Several folders, Nate said, entirely serious. I haven't run that particular experiment in a while, remember? Turns out the hypothesis needed updating. You wrote a whiteboard equation my mother fell in love with. You do not get to claim scientific clarity as your defense for anything. That whiteboard changed my whole year, Nate said, and for once there was no irony in it all. You know, he went on, watching the current bend patiently around the point. In my work, there's a moment in a reaction, the saponification point, where everything before it was just the approach. All the mixing, the heat, the waiting. Nothing's finished yet. But right at that point, the whole system turns. It becomes something new, and it stays that way. It doesn't need convincing anymore. Sofia studied him, the wind pulling a strand of hair loose across her face. Are we at that point? I think we're close, Nate said. And for a man who'd spent his whole life distrusting anything that couldn't be measured, it came out steadier than he expected. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached up, brushed the loose strand of hair back from her face, and kissed her, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't ask permission first because it had already been given weeks ago in 100 smaller ways neither of them had bothered to name until now. Sofia's free hand came up to rest against his chest, not pushing him away, just feeling the exact moment his carefully guarded heartbeat gave up trying to stay careful. When they finally broke apart, Nate kept his forehead against hers a moment longer. I'd still like to find out properly, he said. Slowly, with enough time for it to hold. Slowly, Sofia repeated, laughing softly, a little breathless. From the man who fell for a 4-year-old inside of 5 minutes and needed 3 weeks and a direct intervention from my best friend to admit he'd fallen for her mother. That, Nate said, is exactly why I'm insisting on slowly this time. My track record with fast is terrible. Mia, choosing that exact moment to abandon the heron, came barreling back down the bank and grabbed both their hands at once, delighted by the sight of 2 adults finally doing something sensible, swinging between them as they walked. 3 shadows stretching long and easy across the water in the last gold light of the day. Behind them, the plant kept humming, steady and patient, the way any well-run process should. Proof, if either of them still needed it, that some things, given the right conditions and enough careful attention, really can reach a state that holds. That Sunday, Eleanor insisted on dinner again. No whiteboard required this time. Just a phone call, and the particular tone Sofia had learned, over 37 years, meant arguing was pointless. Vivian was already installed at the head of the table when they arrived, a fresh pot of gumbo going. And she took one look at Nate and Sofia walking in with their hands still loosely linked and let out a small, satisfied humph that somehow contained an entire Cajun opera of vindication. Don't say it, Sofia warned, pulling out a chair. I didn't say anything. Vivian ladled soup with the serene innocence of a woman who had, in fact, already said everything weeks ago on a porch in French. I'm only sitting here, minding my own gumbo. Meme told me the very night you two met her, Eleanor said, setting a basket of bread on the table, entirely unbothered. Right there on the porch, while you're putting me to bed. She said, and I quote, that man is going to be around long after the leaves turn, and I told her she was being dramatic. Look at us now. She pointed her spoon between Nate and Sofia's joined hands with the triumphant air of a woman collecting on a bet she'd never technically placed. Nobody said anything about anybody being around forever, Nate said. And for the first time all evening, his ears went faintly red, the first blush anyone at that table had ever managed to get out of him. Not yet, Vivian said placidly, and took a long, satisfied sip of her tea, as if the matter were already filed and dated somewhere she alone had access to. Mia, unbothered by the entire conversation happening over her head, tugged on Nate's sleeve. Nate, Meme says you have to eat 2 bowls or she gets sad. Is that a real rule? It's a very old rule, Vivian said gravely, not looking up from the pot. Older than the Constitution. Older than me, Eleanor added, and I taught chemistry to 3 generations of this parish. So that's saying something. Nate looked at Sophia, silently asking whether resistance was worth the effort. Sophia only shook her head, fighting a smile of her own. 2 bowls, she said. Welcome to the family, I guess. He ate 2 bowls. Nobody at that table needed him to say anything else about it. Vivian refilled his tea without asking, the same way she had the morning after he'd stayed up all night with the reactor. And this time, Nate didn't tell her she didn't have to. He just said thank you, and meant it, and let the evening go on being exactly as loud, unserious, and full as it clearly intended to be.